at one level, my ending up in Moscow was a set of coincidences. And those coincidences could go way back in time, but I think the major starting point for a document like this would be the coincidence of my going to graduate school at Indiana University. I got my PhD from UCLA, and my mentors were both from Indiana University. And both of them were involved in the application of mathematics in psychological theorizing. Mm-hmm. One in the area of sensory perception, Edward Carteret, and the other in mathematical learning theory, and that was Richard Atkinson, who's still alive and is here at UCSD, but with whom I had interactions over a long period of time. And the two of them convinced me that I had to go to Indiana and study with William Estes, who was their mentor, one of their mentors. I was convinced. I had done some experimental work with Carteret, and I was beginning to do some experimental work with Atkinson, and so it was natural if your teacher say to go there and you can get in there. And then Estes accepted me as a graduate student because his students had recommended me. Yeah. So my wife and I go to Indiana, and she goes kicking and screaming all the way.
She didn't want to.
What's Indiana University to her? She didn't want to get a divorce over that, so she was willing to give it a try. And it turned out to be very good for her. She went in, she was admitted into an elite program in English, and it shaped her career in a lot of nice ways. For me, going to graduate school there was related to becoming a learning theorist who ran rats and maybe undergraduates pushing buttons, and in the style of the research of that time, American learning. It turned out that Indiana had this very old-fashioned structure of its graduate program, to which I had paid no attention when I went. Right. I was just going to work with Estes, and whatever else had to be done, you would do it. But it turned out that in order to get a PhD in psychology, you had to pass examinations in 2 foreign languages.
Wow.
And you had to have a minor in some other area. Okay, odd. So I go and I take French the day I walk in before I forget it from high school, in college. And do that exam, and that one's over with. No second language. Very busy first year of graduate school, and I'm going to graduate school and working as hard as I can, and I don't want to think about taking a language. And I'm taking mathematics as my minor. Now, the truth about me is that I'm a horrendously bad mathematician.
I was about to ask, are you good at math?
I'm a terrible man. But I was able to, given the kinds of mathematical models that were available at the time, they were of a logical structure that I was able to deal with and think about, and even have interesting ideas about it. And I could sort of do the mathematics, but if I went off in the wrong direction in algebra, I'd go for a long time before I figured out I'd done something wrong. Whereas Estes, who was also very bad at algebra, which was necessary, was very good at knowing when he'd gone 1 or 2 steps wrong. So he just... so in any event, here I was doing that, but I was really struggling with the math. And you've got to get good grades in your minor as well, right? And and then there's the second language thing. And in the middle of that, I go to pick my wife up at her Department of English, in a new big tall building at the time in Indiana. And I think I know where it is, so I go over there, I push the button on the elevator, and I get off, and I'm standing in front of the history department. And next to the history department, there's a mimeograph sign that says, "How would you like to go to Russia?" So Russia at the time was very interesting. I come from a radical family. People talked about Russia. You're curious about Russia. But Russia also was where Ivan Pavlov was. Right? And American learning theory and Russian Pavlovian theory were very close to each other.
I see.
Including an American version of the second signal system, which was mediated stimulus response learning theory, which developed here in the 1940s and was part of sort of my entryway of trying to interpret what that was all about. So I walked in saying, well, that could be interesting, because my wife and I hadn't gone abroad, and all our friends had gone abroad when they got married and so on, and we thought, why not? After graduate school, we'll go abroad somewhere. And so I walk into the office and say, I'm interested in that. How do you do that? And they say, well, you have to apply. And to apply, you have to pass a Russian area language requirement. So you have to learn Russian. And you have to take these classes. And the classes were with people like Richard Tucker, who was a American political scientist expert on sort of Sovietologist type, wrote a book on Stalin and so on. Those classes were interesting to me. I could pass those classes a lot easier than I could pass calculus or, never mind, where I'd have to go in mathematics. And I needed a second language in order to be able to get a PhD in psychology. And if they let you into this program, I got a 10% raise in my stipend. So they were going to pay me extra money to get a PhD. And I might not go to Russia, whatever that was about, and that was because I got off on the wrong floor. No? Okay.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so then I go to look. Then I go to look, like who's around in Russia, and I come across an article by Lauria and Vinogradov on semantic reflexes. Semantic reflex is something, as an American learning theorist, I could perfectly well understand, and I could relate it to language, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. They're using a form of Pavlovian theory to theorize about language. That's an exciting idea. So it was, then I learned Russian by reading like Luria and Yudovich about the twins who were separated.
Yes.
And of course the Lauria and Vinogradov article. And I wrote to Luria and said, can I come to there and do a postdoc? And he wrote back and said, oh, sure, just if the Americans will send you, we'll take you. Right. So he always wanted international contacts. So he was a hub of international contacts. That was, I mean, he accepted me, and the Americans allowed me to go. My wife and I both learned Russian. We both took regular, like, introductory Russian classes and spent time in the dormitory speaking Russian English with the other graduate students and so on, creating this funny language. And then you get on an airplane and you go to Moscow. And at the time, Sheremetyevo Airport was like an airplane hangar. It was a very small building. And subsequently, it was built across the way from it in a bigger building, and probably there's another building wherever Sheremetyevo has gone to. But that's how we ended up in Moscow. And the deal was that I would work under Luria's directorship. I would work in his laboratory, and at least half the year, and that he would also simultaneously arrange for me to work in laboratories of different people around, to the extent that I was interested in doing that. And then we went there. He was away. We were met by Oleg Tikhomirov, who knew something about computers and mathematics and psychology and was a student of Luria's. On Sunday, when Luria came back from his dacha, we went and had tea at his place. And the first thing he asked me in Russian was, "Вы говорите по-русски?" And I said, "Немножко." And that was the last time he spoke to me in English. He would never speak to me in English. That was the sort of beginning of immersion into Russian psychology. And then he sat me down and did a cultural plan, an academic plan and a cultural plan.
Oh.
Right. So you'll spend this such and such amount of time. I was interested in Sokolov and orienting reflexes. So that's how I came to work with Olga Vinogradov, and I did research with Sokolov. I did research in the Institute of Higher Nervous Activity with dog reflexes of dogs. Mm. I subsequently did research back when I returned to the United States. My first research were mathematical models of escape and avoidance conditioning in dogs. And that has a longer history where I continued with that for a while. But then what I did was, basically while we were there, on the academic program at least, was to get up in the morning, take the metro downtown, go over to the Borjenko Institute, you just transfer, to go to the Borjenko Institute. You go to laboratory meetings, you go on grand rounds and you visit, and while Luria would do his testing, I would watch that. And I conducted experiments on semantic reflexes because he was being very accommodating to me. That was how the interest. He wasn't interested in that anymore, but he arranged for me to do work with Homskaya on temporal lobe patients. And there was some scheme about looking at it, and nothing much came of that. But in the process, my oral Russian became relatively good, because you're working very closely with people in a variety of ways. I read Russian slowly, and I write Russian abominably. I write Russian very rapidly with Latin characters, because in the beginning of the internet, when I was interacting with Russians, there was no Cyrillic internet protocol, international protocol. So everybody in the beginning, many computer folks even believed that the internet, you could only write Russian in Latin letters. It was impossible to do it in Russian, in Cyrillic. In any event, so obviously that early influence continued for a long time, and it continues today. So you and I and Volodya Kudryavtsev and others are worrying about imagination, trying to combine Russian theories and whatever theories other people come up with. And so it had a very long-lasting influence. And that's how I came to be there. I guess the continuation of that is that when I returned, I'd met a number of interesting people while I was there. Americans of various kinds, who were interested in the fact that I was there, Bronfenbrenner being one of them. So it led to a longer-term relationship with Bronfenbrenner, because when my wife and I went, Bronfenbrenner and his family were there. And so we knew each other a little bit there. And our interests converged at a later time, serendipitously. I guess the immediate continuation of that is that I returned home. I have we might have talked about this last week. I have an active passport, which is unusual. And I'm in a place where they're interested in sending a mathematical psychologist to Africa. And so I arranged with them to go and do that. And then that leads me back to Luria, so that the cross-cultural culture and development, Vygotskian activity theory, they're all bound together by sort of this set of events which are unanticipatable. I won't say they're accidental, because they're constraints operating I don't understand, but they feel accidental at the time, right? There's no particular reason why Supis would have a project in Africa. I didn't go to Moscow because I knew that Supis had a project in Africa. So if I went to Moscow, I could be on that project. It didn't exist, right? Yeah. So you're just in a. I think that's why people talk about zeitgeist. You're just in a sort of flow. You're in a sociocultural flow that because you're a part of it in a way where you're not fully aware of it. You don't see it from the outside. You only are experiencing it.
Well, what's interesting for me that you went into Russia under this sort of confusion that American learning mediated learning theory And did they really use the word mediated at the time? Definitely not.
Yeah. Of course, mediated.
Yeah. Wow.
It's mediated XR theory. That's written. That's why the LCAC autobiography is interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that that story is written with the references to Margaret Keane and the people who did it, and with a diagram that shows here's a Vygotskian SXO. And here's Margaret Keane, the same, except it's an R instead of an O.
Yeah.
It's response instead of subject object, but it's mediation, and you look at it and you go, and I respond. I very often recognize similarities in theories because of the similarities in their geographical, their representations.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So representations help, I think, to capture something about underlying the indirectness part of mediation is common in those.
Mm-hmm.
The implied one-way nature of it in the stimulus response one is wrong, but because it's a two-way, it's a relational thing. But that's okay. When you look at it and it's a static figure, you can say, oh, that's similar, and it was in its own way. It was similar. Of course, there are a lot more similarities you want to find out, and differences. So that's called education.
The Bourdain collab, I remember from my graduate studies. I was Homska student, right?
Uh-huh.
And I remember how, like many years later, they called you Ave American, Nash Americanец. Did you know that?
Yeah. Well, partly that they knew me and that I had worked with them, and partly that when I came back, I was made a mediator by Luria, and he sent me back with a book, a big thick book to translate, and I think it was traumatic aphasia or something. And when we landed in New York, my wife and I went to the publisher, Arthur Rosenthal at Harvard at Basic Books. And terrified that he'd want us to translate this thing, because we felt an obligation to Luria, who'd been very nice to us. Luckily, he had already found a translator, so we were let off of that. But then Rosenthal came while I was at Stanford doing a postdoc. And so the two are really bound together early on. Rosenthal comes to Stanford and he says, there's a 2-volume handbook of Soviet psychology. Published in the USSR. Why don't you edit them and we'll publish them in the United States? So he came in with a project right away. And of course, to do that project, I needed help from Luria. So I was connected with Luria that way. And then Daniel Slobin, who had been an early visitor to Russia, and as a linguist was interested in Russian psycholinguistics. He asked me to be the editor of the translation journal. And there I was, sort of like the obvious person to do that, because there were all of these connections anyway going on. And so everything then became sort of bound together. I was doing different hours of the day. I was working on thinking about the culture and development and cross-cultural research, thinking about experimental methods, thinking about where do you learn the anthropology, how do you do field work like this, and this is not experiments, and at the same time trying to understand what Luria was doing, and what were the Russians doing, and learning about that. And they just stayed interconnected over time. So there was the Luria autobiography, and then there was the publication of Vygotsky.
Was the journal that Soviet Psychology, the translation?
It was Soviet Psychology, and now it's the Journal of Russian and East European
Psychology. Eastern European Psychology. That was the beginning.
Yeah, I don't know how long it'll last, but it still exists.
It still exists, and it's a good journal. I know a lot of people who like it.
Yeah. I think
definitely appreciate you for having a chance, created by you to be able to be heard.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And, from time to time, there's good back and forth there. So it's like, that's a very useful thing to do. The connectivity that we could go into, but I guess other official stuff was that in the 1970s, when I was at when I became a professor at Rockefeller University, The other professor with whom I worked before I became a full professor there was William Estes. And William Estes was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. And he was selected by the Academy to start a commission, an official commission between the American Academy of Sciences and the Soviet Academy of Sciences in psychology. And he was in the same, I worked in his laboratory for many years later in my career, and then I became a professor there, had my own lab, and he asked me would I be his deputy in doing this. Then I became involved in the kind of science diplomacy or something, academy to academy kind of science. And Estes, after a couple of years, we had a conference there on mathematical psychology at Boris Lomov's University, Boris Lomov's Institute in the Academy of Sciences. And then Estes backed away, and I continued, and I sent a number of graduate students to work there in Lomov's Institute, which Lois Holtzman was one. And so Lois was sent there. Laura Martin was another. And there was a third I'm forgetting at the moment. I apologize. And that led to a connection with a woman at Lomov's Institute, Alexandra Belyaeva, Sasha Belyaeva, who studied communication. And that was her topic. And both Lois and Laura went and worked with Belyaeva as their advisor. And then when I began to do communication work using the internet and in connection with the fifth dimension and other stuff that we'll talk about at another time, that when I started to do that, the obvious person for me to do it through was Sasha Belyaeva. I had to do it through Lomov's Institute. He controlled. I couldn't do it through Davidov anymore. There's a difference in power. This was academy to academy, it wasn't our Academy of Education to their Academy of Education, it's our Academy of Sciences to theirs. So it had to go through Lomov. Lomov did not allow Vygotskians in his institute if he could help it. He would not allow, he would allow Davidov, he would not allow Zenchenko. Zenchenko was refused. So I was caught between the two sides, in that way, always. I had friends who worked in Lomov's Institute, and I had friends who I'd go and spend time with, and Lomov knew it, and, Lomov did not make a big deal with the fact that because I treated him completely honestly. I didn't enter into the divisions between them, except to say, I'm not a part of those divisions, so just leave me out of that.
You were the real diplomat.
Well, I was in a diplomatic situation. I was literally, that's a role. It's a thing about social institutions. You occupy a role, you fulfill the role, or you get the help, or you take, and you fulfill it in the ways that larger institutions are satisfied by, or you're not going to be in that role for very long. So, and it's not that I didn't find it effortful. I think all of that work, especially when I started to do work on the internet, I felt literally like the tensions between the two countries were going through my body. As I was sitting there translating, you could feel we were trying to cooperate where the weight of non-cooperative forces was like extreme, right? Very. So that was in the sense that you'd get up at a certain time. I got up at 5 in the morning because that was 4 in the afternoon.
Time difference,
right. So if you're going to do it, it does in fact. And my wife put up with all of that, which was very nice of her. She's a writer, so she worked at home, and she likes to get up early in the morning too. It's good. That's why we're still married. So I think that in terms of like the Russian stuff, it'll come up again because it's completely entwined, right? It's entwined. And it's just that you publish in different places, you operate in different institutions in different ways. And so in a sense that my work on ecological validity that I take up later on was not motivated initially by the work that I did with the Russians. Ecological validity is not actually a topic taken up by Vygotsky, as far as I know. Right. Right. Yeah. And he did not have a big respect for experimentation. He did these things pour voir in order to take a look at what they looked like. No. Because let's see. So you can imagine him with his daughter, right, trying to get cookies up on a shkafa somewhere high, and he's looking at the kid trying to do that, and the kid turns to him and starts to use him as a tool. Yeah, and I think that was true. I mean, that's so there's this kind of intuitive interaction of the way in which you're sort of practicing everyday life and the way you're theorizing and stuff. And of course,
this is a very interesting thread for me, because your consequent work and attention to the context, right? In general, in all your body of work.
Yeah.
Probably stemming from your early attention to ecological validity and experience.
Was it a question of, right, that brings up the question. I mean, so the logic of our doing the same task in different settings was directly a way to address the problem of ecological validity, because in principle, under what constraints can it be the same task in a different setting? So obviously you have to create what Luria would have called a functional barrier. You have to create a quasi-closed system within which it's a microcosmos, or a microcosmos.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting.
Figured world. You create a figured world. That would be something that.
Figured world, yeah.
Figured world.
Or a fifth dimension later on.
Or a fifth dimension is a particular way of. I liked Wartoshki's idea of tertiary artifact or fifth dimension. But one of the things that the fifth dimension makes you realize is that as a form of play and representation in this creation of this alternative world, it fits the sort of notion of a tertiary artifact. But if you step back and you think, why am I doing it? It's a primary artifact for me to understand the problem of the failure of successful innovations to be sustained. Right? So if you step back at one level, it's a primary artifact for my research purposes. At the same time, my object of analysis is a tertiary artifact.
Very interesting. And I agree with you. As said, Vygotsky didn't really theorize too much about context. Right?
No, that's why you and I wrote it, right? We had to, right? And the closest you come now is to situation of development, social
situation of development, but he just announced it, right, as a major source of growth.
Right, and so, but I think Hedegaard has done a fair amount to try to flesh out what Vygotsky should have meant, at least, by social situation of development. And, I think her work, it just took a long time. The person who pointed that out first was Gershon Breslov, who's a Lithuanian, I think, psychologist, Latvian psychologist. And I didn't really understand. His way of explaining it, I just thought, that's really a strange way to sort of, that must be Vygotsky talking about context. But I didn't follow up with Gershon properly. Now I think that one has to really, for example, one of the things about a really good topic is context in the social, how do we think about context in the social situation development? Let's do that as a half-hour thing. We, of course, did not like Vygotsky's ideas about the way they were used by Americans. And that's constantly in XMCA, this question of, do you really want to say that working class people can't think theoretically? You really want to say that? I mean, and that's what Bernstein was saying. I think that, we really resisted, and the political context was quite important, because we were quite opposed to the people who were talking cultural deprivation. They were citing Bernstein and Vygotsky as authority for what they were saying. So, and Brunner was citing Vygotsky for explaining why you have to go to school to develop the concept of conservation in Piaget. And we were saying, no way, this is wrong. And that got us into like, what's wrong with these experiments? And it got us into really, trying to have to think about development. I mean, think about Vygotsky, and it was hard for quite a long time
Mm-hmm.
for us to sort of figure out a way to reconcile what we were doing with the sort of, let's call it contextless version of Vygotskian waves of transformation. It's just like,
yeah.
you know,
And also, maybe just to finish up this thought, but for future marker, the similar way you mentioned one that you didn't particularly like Luria's conclusion about his
oh yeah, no, the same
yeah,
problem.
it's the same topic, right?
Exactly the same topic. And I was, if you read my introduction to even to the Russian version, I was very careful. And you could read Luria's introduction to Scribner and Cole. What are you trying to tell me about these people? And are you trying to tell me that when you do the syllogism, that Ivan, I mean, what is Ivan doing? Is it impossible for him to think in terms of the language is not influencing? What are you trying to say here?
Mm-hmm.
And the anthropological literature says, you know, if Ivan couldn't sort of calculate simple syllogisms, he'd be dead as a doornail. And then Luria showed that it was only for ones that were unfamiliar to them. So you had to depend on the language form.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, that's a really tricky thing. So what we did was to start to play with that. And of course, schooling is, I think, correctly, a place where you're asked to reflect on these things and you learn these language forms. But we don't ordinarily, you and I in our everyday lives, we do not think syllogistically. It's not that it isn't a useful cognitive tool, right, for use in particular settings for particular tasks, but it's not, it hasn't changed the way our minds work. We don't think differently, and we don't think in syllogisms.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole issue of how has literacy influenced the way minds really work, and we've always been very, very cautious, and I remain cautious about that issue to this day, even though we know that there's excellent work by like Stanislas Dehaene on 6 months of literacy training. You can see the brain is beginning to tune up, like laying down tracks. It's tuning up a phonology graphic pathway, so you don't have to spend time seeing that that's a C or a D. You've got to get that automated. So you can begin to see that happening biologically pretty early on. But then the question is, well, what functional system is it a part of? So I think that yes, of course, it's super fascinating that you have these kinds of effects. We knew that we had them before, like with the Portuguese women who grew up in the early 20th century, and they or their sisters went to school. Mm-hmm. And they did these experiments with these women when they were in their 50s or something, and they gave them either real words or pseudo words. Mm-hmm. And they asked the people to pronounce the pseudo words, and the pronunciation of the people who were literate was changed by the fact that they were mediating the way they pronounced it through the alphabet, whereas those who were not literate didn't deal with pseudo words in the same way. When they repeated them, they stayed closer to the pseudo word, and they didn't have it distorted by the alphabet.
Interesting.
What it does is to show that the layers and the heterogeneity of the structures that we use to do our thinking with, or acting with, are just infinitely complicated. I mean, they're really complicated. Only some of them do we have as industrialized, as regularized. Mm-hmm. A lot we just don't. But I mean, that's why we have to keep this sort of two-way thing going at a micro level, or the system comes apart. Mm-hmm. It gets deharmonized. The harmony, the cacophony, the chaos. You have too much chaos.
Yeah.
If you have too little, that's what the Angel of History stuff is about in a way. If you have no chaos, you have no life. If you have life, you have got to have some chaos. That's life.